Good afternoon. I understand you all had a very engaging set of conversations this morning that laid out the cliff that we stand in front of in terms of the federal budget, and talked a lot about where we need to go and what we need to do. I come to you today as an emissary in the area of higher education. My area of expertise actually lie in the fields of China and the economic reforms in China, corporate governance, corporate social responsibility. But for the last 2 years, I've had the wonderful opportunity to be the dean of a business school in the nation's capital, and actually in the heart of the nation's capital. We always brag about the fact that we have the best real estate in the country, if not in the world, because we sit 6 blocks from the White House and across the street from the IMF and the World Bank and the IFC, and that's all very exciting, and things seem great most of the time. But as a dean, you learn that you're no longer an academic, and you can't spend time thinking about high-minded issues like economic reforms in China, and you have to think much more about things like budgets and the costs of education and what we're doing about delivering that education to our nation's children. And even more than that, whether or not that fits well with what the overall concept and the overall goals of the American economy are. So very briefly, to just give you a sense of what I'd like to talk about, and I want to try to leave enough time to actually have some questions and some interaction with you, but I have to tell you that I still have the problems that most academics have, that we talk too much and we make too many slides and we never get through our material. So please feel free to interrupt at any point in time if you have questions or want to go off in a different direction. I'm here to actually just have an exchange with you about some ideas. But I want to talk a little bit about sources of funding, the implications of that for the U.S. economy, the implications for students, and think about who's paying for school and how are they paying for it. And there's another question embedded in there about actually who should go to school. And that has major issues and consequences and implications for how we think about the U.S. economy, and I know a little bit about that, so I'll throw some tangents in there about that. And just to make this interesting, I'm going to move from macroeconomic data and the idea of flows of budget and talk about 2 specific cases that I know pretty well, so that we can actually give some meat to the discussion of what it is that we're actually talking about. And so I'm going to talk about 2 different universities and how they're dealing with what I actually view as our own cliff, our own crisis, of how we are going to pay for education in this country, what the economic model is for higher education, and how that relates to the budgetary processes that are going on at the federal and state levels. So without further ado, let me dive in. The first thing that I would like to say here is just, if we think about where education funding is and what the sources of discretionary budget authority are. Of course, the vast majority of this is defense spending, and that's not a big surprise, and maybe that's the right priority for this country, although I'm going to come back to this issue a little bit later because this has real consequences for the viability of the U.S. economy. There are a number of other countries that have very different spending priorities, and I'm not arguing we shouldn't have a defense-oriented spending priority, but we have been cutting back further and further on our investment in education, and it has real consequences for the viability of the U.S. workforce and our ability to compete in today's global economy. $68 billion sounds like a lot of money, but just to put that in perspective, that's about the same amount as the federal contracting business in the D.C. metropolitan area. Okay? That's actually not a lot of money when we think about the amount of money that goes into education. Now, when we think about how that actually builds out, there are a number of different ways that this money flows into the hands of students and into the hands of institutions. We have Title I grants, IDEA grants from the state level, and Pell grants. And these programs are all very good, and they're pretty much equal parts of the pie. if you look at what's happened over the course of the last decade, it's been pretty steady, with the one blip coming from the U.S. stimulus. So the stimulus package that was passed in 2009 had a huge amount of money that went into funding higher education. I would argue, again, as an educational administrator, that was a good thing, but I also live in a world in which I know that we have fixed pies. I know we have to be careful with how we spend things, and I know we have to think very deeply about what our educational models are and what our funding models are within education, because I am from a private nonprofit institution that it's expensive. It's an expensive model of education, and we actually need to think very deeply about whether or not our value proposition is the right one for the world, because we benefit greatly when there's an uptick in the federal funding, and we hurt deeply when questions of whether or not the amount of funding that's been committed through the NIH or NSF or all of the things that we're dependent on that are at the whim of Capitol Hill are at risk. And so it's a very precarious model in some ways. Now, the thing that we're really interested in here, and this was sort of the assignment that I was given for this talk, you can see that our expense structure comes from many different pieces of this pie. The vast majority of it is tuition and fees, and then we have other things like endowment and distribution. As a dean, I've learned that I have to spend a lot of time thinking about two things: revenues and expenses, and so I feel very much like a CEO, much more than an academic. But then the other thing is I have to spend a lot of time as a salesman. I raise money, right? I'm going out and pitching and trying to get money from people who are our alums or people who can get excited about what it is we do. And those are fine, but the issue here that we want to talk about is the impact of the federal budget on higher education. And so I really want to focus on this 33%. What comes from the sponsored programs and the state appropriations that really make a difference for what we do. Now, one of the things that's really important here is you can see that the federal government is crucial for what we do in terms of R&D funding for public and private academic institutions. Academic institutions also do a lot of self-funding. I do a lot of this myself. We're always trying to use the excess resources that we have to do interesting things within programmatic areas. Recently, for example, in my own institution, we've launched a program with the DC government in which the GW School of Business had teamed up with Georgetown School of Business, and the two deans of the business schools were co-chairs of the planning committee that has executed and is going to deliver the DC Strategic Economic Plan for the next 5 years. Those are exciting things, and they're largely self-funded. We had some funding from the DC government on those things, but we invest in those kinds of programs because we believe they have good research implications, and they also have good educational implications for our students. In that particular program, we funded internships for MBA students, 16 MBA students from around the city, from the George Washington School of Business, Georgetown, Howard, and American, all came together to be a part of that plan, and we believe it was a really good plan. So we do those kinds of self-funding things, but the vast majority of what we do as academic institutions is funded by the federal government in the areas of R&D. One of the things, though, that's really interesting to note, and I'm not here to make a normative claim of whether it's good or bad, but I do think it's an important thing to note, is that the per capita funding in these areas is declining precipitously. The projected funding for 2011 to 2013 per student is going to be less than it's ever been, at least within the last 100 years when we've been tracking this stuff. Is that right or wrong? I'm not sure, but it is the case that education is probably one of the greatest and most under-recognized institutions and industries of this country's innovation and change. We have to think very deeply about this question precisely because investment in education is not just investment in K-2 through 12 and how our students are doing on science and math scores internationally. It's really a question of whether or not we're investing in innovation and science and technology in particular, but also in innovations in the areas of humanities, social sciences, analyses of how society works. Now, for years, the United States has been the haven of the best and brightest in these areas. If you look at the top, whatever list you want to look at, top 50, top 100 list of world universities, the U.S. is always 60 to 70% of those lists. But we're going to slip. We're going to slip because of a lack of investment and because of the growing competition from abroad. And so I think it's an interesting question about what the model is and how we actually deal with that model and that change. Now, I can't overemphasize enough the importance of investment in R&D expenditures, particularly for science and engineering. We are very, very weak these days in science and engineering compared to our both emerging economies and advanced industrialized economy peers. We do well at the very high end of the spectrum, so the elite institutions will continue to be elite and they will continue to be great. But those institutions that are in the middle, the institutions that are in the 50 to 100 space, how are we going to fare when we compete with South Korea, Singapore, Finland? And these are actually really important questions for the direction of the U.S. economy. Now, one place that we do very well, you'll notice from this chart on your left, is that the vast majority of funding that is still stable in the United States is in health and human services. And that's because NIH is such a great funder of research. And so one of the things that's kind of an interesting thing just about the demographic bubble that we're experiencing is that healthcare, depending on how you look at it, is somewhere between $3 trillion and $4 trillion of the GDP. So somewhere around, you can measure it as 25%, maybe up to even 30%. But it's a massive part of what is the engine of our economy. And the baby boomers are only getting older. And so there's a period in which we are, this is not going to drop off. And so there's a tremendous amount of interesting innovation that's going to happen in this space. And thankfully, I think the federal government sees this, and the funding for science and development for NIH continues to be very strong. It's much less strong in the physical sciences, in economics, and in the social sciences. And this is really where we see the cuts happening from the federal funding model. And so I just think that this is an important thing, and I want to talk for a few minutes about the implications for the U.S. economy if they're not already laid bare by what I've said so far. Notice that if you do the entire analysis of kind of academic performance on what the U.S. share of R&D is, we're pretty low compared to our advanced industrialized peers. I think that it looks a little dramatic in this case, and so I don't think we should have a catastrophic feeling about this. But the one thing that's important is not just to note the importance of the investment, but it's also important to note the importance of how we have drawn capital from all over the world. So there's a side issue here that we probably won't spend too much time talking about today because it's not really about the federal government's budget, but it is about policies that have to do with how we think about drawing capital from all around the world. If you were an academic in 2001, which I was a young academic in the late 1990s and kind of grew up during that period, and in 2001, September 11th, you noticed a dramatic shift that happened pretty quickly. And maybe it was one that was necessary for our country to go through, but the difficulty for talented people to get H-1B visas to stay in this country became dramatic during that period right after 2001. And again, maybe there were national security issues that were at stake there, maybe not. But the key thing to think about is that we often forget that the productivity revolution of the second half of the 20th century was built on the backs of a lot of those people. And so it's actually a very interesting thing not just to think about investment in R&D, but also to think very deeply about how U.S. policies really shape what we're able to do in terms of capturing talent. As a person who was a China scholar who had many students who came from China to come study with me, it was very clear that they got the message before 2001 and maybe up to 2002, 2003, there was a bit of a lag period. They all wanted to stay. But pretty soon they thought, you know what? What's going on back in my home country is more interesting than here. And we have a very hard time. It's actually a very interesting reverse brain drain that's occurring that I think is a little bit dangerous for what's happening in this country. But there's another thing that I just want to note here. Finland and Singapore are always the top performers in investment in higher education as a percentage of GDP. Now, you can make the case, well, they're small countries. Like, what do they have to worry about? They don't have defense budgets to worry about. They don't have massive infrastructure to worry about. And that's true. But if you look at the comers in these areas, like South Korea and a couple of other players, and of course Japan has always been a big investor, these are very, very serious things to think about because they have fundamental implications for what the level of investment is in terms of infrastructure and innovation. Now, in this country, we're sort of caught in an ideological debate that I think was launched in 1970 by Milton Friedman when he famously appeared on the cover of the New York Times Magazine and made the claim that governments and nonprofit organizations should have nothing to do with markets. You should leave it to corporations and the private sector. They'll figure all these issues out. And there's an argument for the innovation that comes from an unfettered private sector. But if you look at the countries around the world that are doing really well in terms of investment in science and engineering, and investment in technology and technological development, we used to be the best. We're not anymore. We're not. We are actually at a point where we're really suffering in terms of our competition with these other peers. Now, we can make the case that we can sort of dismiss most of them because they're kind of small-time players compared to us in terms of the size of our budget, the size of our country, the size of our infrastructure. But we can't make that case with respect to China. It will happen in 2016 or 2017 that China will surpass us as the largest economy in the world. And we can dismiss them as being just a place of a deep, cheap labor pool and is not an innovative place like we are. But if you do that, you're putting your head in the sand. That's not the reality of the world that we live in today. And that is only going to be turned around through investment in education. Now, here again, I'm not making the case that the federal government should be the source of all of that, but we need to think very carefully about the cliff that we're standing on and really think about the competitors that exist out there for us. Sometimes when I give these talks, because I'm a China scholar and because I'm pretty bullish on the Chinese economy, people come up to me and say, "Why are you so unpatriotic? What's the matter with you?" And sometimes I lose it and I say, I feel like I'm the only one that's being patriotic here. Like, we have to think deeply about our problems and think about how to strategically invest in ways that will solve them. We can't be locked in abstruse political debates that have nothing to do with reality. We have to think very deeply about how to build an economy that actually works. And so that's really what my main issue is with respect to this. Now, I want to continue this discussion about the implications for the U.S. economy, but I want to talk about a little bit of a different issue because I'm here to talk really about higher education. But it's sort of blasphemy in a lot of American society to say not everybody should go to higher education. We actually also live in a society that has destroyed vocational education over the last 40 years, and it's because of a very bizarre political debate on both the left and the right about your ability to talk about the issue of tracking. The other economy that is so Teflon in this world right now, beyond the East Asian economies, is Germany. And it is because they have an industrial policy that integrates education into their thinking. It's because they actually have vocational education tracks that really think deeply about where people should actually be in the economy. And God forbid that you should say that somebody's not performing well in high school and maybe they should actually go into learning technical manufacturing. In this country, it's actually a very interesting thing. As a China person, I get asked often to come talk to companies. And I'll go talk to companies in the Midwest, and they'll tell me they need to go to China and they need a strategy, and they'll kind of lament about the potential loss of IPR in terms of production processing. And then I'll say, well, so tell me why you're going to China. And they say, well, we don't know, but it's going to cost us more. And I'll press more. Why are you going to China? If it's going to cost more, what's the problem? And I'll say, well, the problem is we don't even have the labor here anymore. What are you talking about? You're a company in Cleveland. You've got unemployment of 9.7%. How can you tell me you can't find people to work? And they're not trained anymore to be electrical engineers within manufacturing firms. And so this is the trick of what people will tell you in vocational education. If you press them on the idea of the evisceration of education, they'll say, that's not true. Look at the statistics, Dean Guthrie. You don't know what you're talking about. So you look at the statistics. And it is true that vocational education is up. But almost every vocational education firm that is oriented, school that is oriented towards manufacturing has been replaced by one that's called vocational technical education, which is about computer skills. Right? And so that's very nice. Everybody wants to be a part of the new economy, but it's not good for manufacturing. It's not actually good for thinking about an educational policy that's linked to industrial policy. And we just don't like the idea of talking about industrial policy in this country. And so we get stuck in these questions of letting the market decide what it is that they're going to do. And nobody's actually telling these schools and these firms what it is that they should do. All right? I actually see this personally as a dean. I remember a couple of days, months ago, I was sitting at one of these DC Tech meetups. And I have a program that is Information Systems Technology Management. And I said to one of these people, it was interesting to me because we're in the middle of a job crisis. People can't get jobs. Everybody's worried about getting jobs. There were 500 employers in this auditorium that were trying to hire people. And I leaned over to this woman who had her hand up as someone trying to hire people. And I said, do you hire any GW students? Can I introduce you? And she's like, oh, we never hire GW students. As a dean, you don't want to hear that. Like, what? What? And I said, why? And she said, oh, it's too abstract. Like, we want people who learn C++ programming, and you guys don't teach that in your program. And so we don't, we go to George Mason. Again. You don't want to hear that stuff. But the problem is that nobody wants to be told what the right match is in these kinds of things. And so I actually think that we experience this on an institutional level, but we also experience it on a local and national level. How do we actually think in a very careful way about what the needs of the economy are and how to actually provide for it? So that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's important when we're talking about higher education, not just to talk about the needs of higher education, but also to talk about who should be in higher education and what kind of a vocational sector should we have? How should we actually think about the right distribution of this? And let's have a civil conversation about it, rather than just these polarized sides that can't talk to each other. And so I think that the history of our country is really built on this, but today we're just not prepared for a new global economy. And I think it's a bit of a frightening moment when you spend your late nights thinking about how this is. There's also one tangential issue that I just want to point out, is that we are also in the midpoint of a cycle of globalization. We often think that we're at the end of it and we need to build walls around our economy. We need to kind of build walls at the California-Mexico border, and we need to build walls in terms of China investment here, and we don't want Huawei and Haier and all these Chinese companies buying up everything we do. But we have shipped out over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves that China is sitting on right now. And if we don't get that capital back, our economy is going to be $3 trillion poorer. We cannot afford to have this kind of disposition in the global economy. And so, trust me, this is a setup or a segue for something that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But I think it's just an important issue to think about, because this is the economy that we live in. All right, now, I want to talk very briefly about students. This is a big issue, but it's also going to be a lead-in to what I want to the two case studies that I want to talk about. Everything that I just told you about how the declining inputs from the federal government influence what we do in higher education are important, but they're more important for how we think about the macroeconomic issue for the economy. The bigger issue is the expenses of higher education and the model that was built and how quickly that model has been outpacing inflation and the general costs of everything else that's going on around us. And there's a big question of how we're paying for this. Now, the staggering thing right now, and when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago in the 1980s, I think I came out with something like $10,000 debt, which seemed staggering to me back then. Today, those numbers are very small compared to what undergraduates are experiencing. The average debt today, now I picked DC and New Hampshire here for a reason, but they're just two random places that sort of represent the average of the US. But students in general from undergraduate come out with about $30,000 of debt, and that's just undergraduate. You have to remember that today, if you get a college education, you better assume that you're going to need a secondary degree. You're not going to go very far in the workforce today if you just have a college education. It's different than it was 20 years ago. And so this is just the beginning. $30,000 after undergraduate, and you're probably going to have $150,000 after grad school, right? Now, the other staggering thing is that the percentages are about almost at 100%. Nobody can afford it, right? And so, again, maybe that's right in terms of leveraging resources and thinking about a financial model, but I suspect, given the level of default that's going on with student loans, it's actually not the right model. So I think that it's something that we need to think very deeply about. Here again, just if you look at the costs, now bear in mind these are average costs, right? So we're talking about private not-for-profit institutions that cost on the order of $40,000 a year, but for many it's much more if you add in all of the costs that go into these these institutions. The state system is better, but the state system is looking at a cliff as well. There are over 3,000 four-year public and nonprofit degree-granting institutions in the United States, and I would predict that 20 years from now, we may be looking at half of those. Half. Now, that doesn't mean they're all going to go away. Some of them will become two-year colleges, some will become community colleges, but we are going to see a dramatic paring of the system. Now, when we see things like what happened at UVA and the kind of crisis of leadership there, that didn't come from nowhere. We don't know what happened behind the scenes there, but I promise you it was about budgetary issues. It was about a sense among the trustees that not enough innovation and anxiety and crisis management was happening at the presidential level. Now, it turned out that the trustees managed that process very badly, but UVA, think about it, is one of our premier public institutions in this country. I graduated also from one of our premier public institutions, the University of California, Berkeley, and I can tell you the crisis there is very real. And so the question of what we're going to do about this system, whether it's in the private not-for-profit or the public not-for-profit sector, I think is very, very real. Look at this. Look at that change over the course of a four-year period in terms of what the costs are for students. I think it's such a dramatic statement on where things are going. And so if you look at the number of students then, because of the rise in costs, that need loans to actually get these things done, you start to see where the crisis comes from. Now here again, that may harken back to the question that I was talking about before. Should everybody be going to college? I'm not sure. But that's sort of the world we live in, and we've lived in that world since the early 1970s, and the expansion of higher education really began to occur with all of the land-grant institutions that were formed in the 50s and 60s. But you know, the notion in the United States that everybody should have access to a college education became very much the culture of the time in the 1970s and 1980s. And so it's a very powerful thing to really think about how that mindset has changed. And here again, if you look at the amount that the federal government can help compared to the rapid rise in costs, the two things are just not in step with each other. And so this is a little bit less The first part is really kind of thinking deeply about the implications of the federal government and what that actually means and what it means for our economy in general. There's a second piece of this that's really thinking deeply about, is our economic model right? And how can we actually make sure that we are tracking with those rapid rises in costs? Now, I want to shift gears a little bit right now and talk about two case studies. And this will seem like diving in a little more micro, but I think it'll be more interesting to do this just because it'll give you a sense of some very specific things that are happening as solutions, okay? So I'm going to talk about two cases, two universities, a random Mid-Atlantic university that I know pretty well. I won't say which one. And then another Northeastern university that I don't know as well personally, but I've studied them. So District of Columbia, it's actually a really interesting place in terms of higher education. Before I came here, I knew about 5 or 6 institutions of higher education, but there's actually 26 institutions in this area if you look at the metropolitan area. 67,000, almost 63,000 full-time and part-time students enrolled. It's a tremendous place of higher education. A lot of professionals, a lot of PhDs. In my own institution, in about a 6-block radius, supposedly there's about 3,000 economists, PhD-granted economists. I mean, that's kind of an amazing thing to think about of just how dense the mind power is in this area. New Hampshire, oh, that's my institution, George Washington University. I didn't mean to give away what I'm going to talk about, but New Hampshire is a little bit different. It's a very bucolic area, and it's a little sleepier, but it's a state that has higher education needs. It doesn't have the kind of powerhouse setting of institutions that you would think of besides that little college called Dartmouth, but we're not going to talk about Dartmouth. But it's a state that has a lot of higher education institutions, similar numbers of full-time and part-time students, and similar numbers in terms of the amount of funding, although DC gets more from the Pell Grant world. Now, I want to talk today, though, about a very specific institution, Southern New Hampshire University. So I'm going to compare these two institutions and tell you two stories about the path out to give you a sense of the major forces that I think are transforming higher education today. If you look at the direct loan volume, DC kind of outpaces New Hampshire. They're pretty similar on Pell Grants for the two institutions that I want to talk about. Again, GW is a little bit higher than Southern New Hampshire. And if you look at the Pell Grant volume by state, it's, again, the gap sort of widens here. Undergraduate tuition, not surprisingly, GW as an institution, it's one of the more expensive institutions in the country, and the others pale in comparison. You'll note also that the federal aid is pretty close in these two, so we have a lot of ground to make up there. The really interesting thing, though, that I want to talk about is this. How did this happen? You can see that the percentage of students receiving financial aid hit a huge uptick at the University of Southern New Hampshire a couple of years ago. Now, when I say financial aid, I'm not talking about federal financial aid. I'm talking about financial aid in general, which includes financial aid from the institution. And so you might ask the question, what happened to this institution in 2009? Because they have closed the gap significantly in being able to provide the resources for kids to go to school. So what did they do? In 2009, the University of Southern New Hampshire, you may have read about this because it's been written about in the Chronicle of Higher Education and other places, they stole the #2 guy at a company called Embanet. Embanet is a company that's a part of a consortium of companies called Embanet Compass. It's actually owned largely by Michael Milken, that is really driven for innovation in distance education. Here's a number that I want you to remember from this. University of Southern New Hampshire last year did $73 million in revenues with a 41% profit margin, and they're projected in 2012 to do $100 million in profits. We're not supposed to talk about profits in higher education. We talk about overages and whatever you're supposed to say. I don't know. You guys are accountants. I don't know. But we're not supposed to say we did have, but I can guarantee you as deans, we think about profits and losses. $100 million in profits in 2012. And that money is being poured back in to the funding of education for students, to the financing of faculty, to the financing of research. And so here's an institution that doesn't have its head in the sand. It actually has embraced the issue of distance and blended education and said, you know what? A new world is coming, and we can't count on the federal government anymore. But what we can do is think in innovative ways like we're trying to train our students to do, and we can actually change the game. We can change our situation and pour those resources back into the traditional education models and into the research funding models and into the student aid that we need to do. So I love this institution because they actually have taken a proactive approach to saying, what is the world doing today? How is the world changing? And what are we going to do about it? The model is broken, but there are ways that we can innovate that are in lockstep with what's transforming in the world today. And we will actually use that then to deliver education for our state's children. So it's a great model and a great story. And there are a number of stories out there like that. My own institution is engaging in this. We have a very healthy online healthcare MBA program. In January, we're going to be launching an online MBA program, and we have a couple of others. But the main point is that this is the future. And if we can't think about that and then think about how to use those resources to then prop up what we've done traditionally, then we're all going to lose. Now, my time is short, so I would just want to raise one more issue that I think is the other major issue that is the solution for these problems. So speaking specifically as a dean of a business school, but I'm also in some ways the ambassador for international education for George Washington in general. I hope my president isn't upset with me for claiming that title. He hasn't given it to me, but I spend a lot of time proselytizing about this issue. MBA applications are down everywhere in the world, except for in two places, China and India. Now, the problem with a place like China is that you can see where the flows of students come from and where they're going. The United States is the #1 destination of Chinese graduate students, and many, many more would like to come. And many of these students can ace whatever standardized tests we put in front of them. The problem is if you think in this very kind of distorted way, which you're trained to think as a dean, well, we can bring the students in, and that will help our numbers on the front end, but if we can't place them in jobs, that'll hurt us on the back end, and then, you know, we don't deliver in terms of what we need to for the rankings. But there are ways, actually, if you start to engage deeply with these countries, rather than just thinking of them as sources of capital, human capital, but instead also thinking of them as places where you can engage very deeply to help us as institutions, our students, but also our countries think broadly about our embeddedness in the global economy. The opportunities are phenomenal. So one of the things that we've been doing at the George Washington School of Business is we've been building a very deep and ambitious China initiative in which we're building a campus in Suzhou, which is a second-tier city. If you've spent any time in China and you haven't gone to Suzhou, you should go. It's, in my opinion, the most amazing economic development story in all of China. But it's one that also has implications for thinking about how we train students, not just in China, and not just giving our students a sense of how to be in China, but also how we build career services for students to go back to China. Right? And so we are working very hard to build those kinds of initiatives that will really define what we're doing. The problem with these things is that it's very complicated to be in places like China. And so as institutions of higher education, you've got to decide to invest. You've got to decide to build those bridges. We have now a whole process of a whole foreign-owned enterprise, wholly foreign-owned enterprise there, and we have a very complex relationship with the Suzhou Industrial Park Commission. But these things are all leading to a strategy that then has allowed us to launch programs that have a number of different organizational forms to them. They are programs that have relationships with institutions in China, like Renmin University, and a Master's of Finance, and a Master's of Accountancy program. And then as we go through those processes, we start to see deeper relationships with cities, and we start to see deeper ties within the institutional environment that then make our university truly a global player. And so I think that institutions of higher education have to think down that road. We have to think both in terms of the changes in media and the ways in which we can actually gain resources that will fill in what we're losing from the federal government. But we also have to look outward and think very deeply about our position in the global economy and how we train our students to be truly global citizens. And so we're in the process of building those issues, and eventually we'll build, an island campus there that I think will be very exciting. So the thing that I would just want to conclude with here is that there are tectonic shifts in the global and national economies, and these are placing enormous pressures on U.S. higher education. I think that many of the institutions, as I mentioned, that exist right now will not exist in their same form 2 decades from now. But the opportunity is also great if we think very deeply about how to innovate and change. And it's hard to change institutions of higher education, but we have to actually take the responsibility and do it. We have to think about the media of delivery. We have to think about global expansion. And we have to think about questions of access to higher education, who should have access, and the types of institutions that should be there. So let me just end there, and I'll take any questions that you all may have. Thank you.